The American frontier did not break men slowly. It didn't ease you into it. There was no warning, no grace period, no mercy extended to the unprepared. The frontier found the thing you loved most, the thing you had quietly built your entire reason for living around. And it came for that first. Not your land, not your money, not your life. The thing you loved. That is how it has always worked out here. And in the summer of 1878, on the bleeding edge of Ford County, in Kansas, 3 miles south of a cattle town so violent they called it the wickedest little city in America, a 23-year-old man had already learned that lesson the hard way. He had learned it so completely, so devastatingly, that he had done what only the truly shattered do. He had stopped loving anything. Anything, that is, except one. There was a dog on the ridge of a red clay bluff. Gray. Enormous. Built like something the frontier itself had assembled from spare parts and bad memories. His face carried a jaw scar that ran the length of a man's palm, white and clean against the darker fur. The kind of scar that doesn't come from an accident. It comes from something that wanted him dead and got close enough to mean it. One ear was notched. His left hind leg had been mangled down to the bone and healed crooked. He walked with a slight drag that strangers mistook for weakness. Our strangers only made that mistake once. His name was Huck, and he was the only living soul on this earth that the man in the dugout below had not yet found a reason to stop trusting. Not a person, not a neighbor, not kin, a dog. Because every person Dallas had ever extended his hand to had eventually found a use for it that wasn't his own. Every person had wanted something. His labor, his silence, his compliance, his land, his grief, his name on something that would cost him later. People were transactions dressed up as relationships. Dallas had the receipts to prove it. And whatever had happened back in Tennessee, whatever had happened back wherever the whispers said he'd come from, had been the final, irreversible proof. So at 23, an age when most men were still naive enough to believe in other people, Dallas had closed the ledger. He had walked 3 miles south of Dodge City, carved himself a hole in a Kansas bluff, and then declared himself done with the human race. And for 2 years, it had worked. For 2 years, the silence had held. For 2 years, Huck had been enough. The prairie had been enough. The jackrabbits and the fire and the cold, indifferent stars had been enough. For 2 years, the wound had stayed closed. What Dallas did not know, what he could not have calculated, even with all his hard-won suspicion and all his carefully constructed walls, was that something was already riding toward him across that flat Kansas horizon. Not a lawman, not an enemy. A woman with a broken wagon, a silver whistle, and the rare, dangerous ability to make a dog that hated the world sit down in the middle of a gale and choose her. And when that happened, when that dog looked up at a stranger and chose her in a way he had never fully chosen anyone but Dallas, Dallas was going to feel it like a bullet he never heard coming. He was about to lose the only thing he had left. He just didn't know it yet. Before we ride any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy frontier stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Here is something nobody tells you about isolation. It doesn't feel like suffering, not at first. It feels like relief. It feels like finally exhaling after years of holding your breath around people who kept costing you more than they were worth. It feels like wisdom, like a decision only the strong are brave enough to make. That is the lie it tells you while it builds the walls higher. And the cruelest part? The one bond that finally breaks through. The one that reaches across all that carefully constructed distance and pulls a man back toward the living. It is never the bond you planned for. It is never the one that arrives on your terms, with your permission, on a day you felt ready. Sometimes it arrives on 4 legs, scarred, moody, gray as a November sky. And sometimes it arrives behind a broken wagon wheel in the middle of a Kansas windstorm. We want to ask you something, and we need you to answer it honestly. Have you ever trusted an animal more than you trusted the people around you? Have you ever looked at a dog, or a horse, or any creature that couldn't lie to you, and felt safer in that silence than in any conversation you'd had in years? Have you ever built walls so high, for such good reasons, that one morning you woke up and realized you'd forgotten what a gate felt like? If any part of that lands, if any part of that sounds like someone you know or someone you've been, then this story was made for you. Because what we are about to tell you is the story of a man who opted out of humanity entirely, who made his peace with the prairie and the silence and one scarred, gray dog, and called it a life. And then a woman came along who didn't ask his permission to matter. Neither did the dog. By the end of this story, one of them will walk into fire for the other. It will not be who you think. Stories like this one don't survive unless someone keeps telling them. Subscribe. Don't let history bury what the frontier died to teach us. To understand what Dallas was running from, you first have to understand what Dodge City was. Not the legend, not the dime novel version with the heroic lawman and the clean moral victory at high noon. The real thing. The breathing, stinking, groaning, magnificent, a terrible real thing. In the summer of 1878, Dodge City was the most concentrated point of human chaos on the American continent. Every cattle season, tens of thousands of longhorns were driven up the Western Trail from Texas. Dusty, lowing columns of beef that stretched so far back across the plains you couldn't see where they ended. They converged on Dodge City's railhead like a river finding its mouth. And behind every herd came the men who had driven them. Trail hands who had spent months in the saddle eating dust and sleeping on hard ground, arriving in Ford County with a month's wages burning a hole in their pocket and absolutely no intention of spending it quietly. Front Street answered that need without apology. Saloons shoulder to shoulder. Gambling houses running day and night. The Long Branch, the Alamo, the Lady Gay, establishments that didn't bother with subtlety because subtlety didn't pay. The air on Front Street smelled of whiskey, sawdust, coal smoke, and the particular sweat of men who hadn't seen a bathhouse in 60 days. The piano music that spilled out of every doorway collided in the street and became something that wasn't music at all, just noise at war with itself. And presiding over all of it, almost with a badge and a reputation that carried more stopping power than the weapon on his hip, was Bat Masterson, Ford County Sheriff. A man who understood that law on the frontier was not a system. It was a performance. You maintained order not by enforcing every rule, but by making absolutely certain that every man in that town believed, without question, that crossing the line would cost more than it was worth. In Dodge City, your reputation was your currency. Spend it wrong and you were broke in ways money couldn't fix. This was the world 3 miles north of the Red Clay Bluff. 3 miles. In another context, a pleasant walk. Out here, it was the distance between everything and nothing, between the roar and the silence, between a town that never stopped building itself and a man who had stopped entirely. The people of Dodge City had opinions about that man. They always do, about the ones who refused to participate. Some said he was hiding from a murder charge back in Tennessee. Others said Texas, said there was a woman involved, said he'd done something that couldn't be undone, and the solitude was his penance. The teamsters who passed his bluff on the southern trail said he had the eyes of someone who had watched everything burn and decided warmth wasn't worth the risk. Nobody knew the truth, and Dallas made certain of that. What the town saw On the one day a month he rode Cinder up Front Street to trade pelts for supplies, was a young man who moved through the crowd like he was already somewhere else. He didn't linger. He didn't drink. He didn't make eye contact long enough to invite conversation. He was a ghost wearing a man's face. And Dodge City, being Dodge City, filed him away under dangerous and left him alone. That was exactly what he wanted. 23 years old. Sit with that for a moment. Because it matters more than anything else about him. 23. The age when most men are still building the architecture of their lives. Still making the kind of mistakes that teach rather than destroy. Still carrying enough hope to get back up after the ones that cost them. At 23, a man is supposed to be at the beginning of something. Supposed to be laying foundations, not abandoning them. Supposed to be reaching outward, not carving himself a hole in a Kansas bluff and pulling the silence in after him like a blanket. Dallas was 23 years old, and he was already finished, not broken. That is the important distinction, and if you miss it, you miss him entirely. A broken man is a man still in the wreckage, still surrounded by the pieces, still flinching at the memory of the impact. Dallas was not in the wreckage. He had walked away from it, deliberately, quietly, and with the kind of calm that only comes when a man has already done his grieving and arrived at the cold, clear shore on the other side. He had made a decision. People were a losing investment. The math didn't work. Whatever you put in, your trust, your time, your labor, your name, the soft and unguarded parts of yourself that you only show when you believe someone has earned them. It came back to you damaged, or it didn't come back at all. And he had run the numbers enough times to stop questioning the result. So he had stopped investing. Where he came from was a question Dodge City couldn't stop asking, even though Dallas had never given anyone reason to believe he would answer it. Tennessee was the most popular theory, and some said there had been a land dispute, the kind that starts with raised voices at a property line and ends with someone in the ground and someone else riding hard for the territorial border before the law could form an opinion. Others said Texas, said it was something worse than land, said there was a family involved, a name that had been trusted, and a trust that had been turned into a weapon. Nobody knew. And Dallas had constructed his life specifically so that nobody ever would. The dugout itself was a declaration. A man who builds a home above ground is a man who expects to stay, who expects visitors, who expects his life to have witnesses. A man who carves himself into the side of a bluff is a man who has made his peace with disappearing. The ceiling was low enough that Dallas had to duck through the doorway. A doorway he had framed with timber so thick it would slow a bullet. The single window faced south, toward the open prairie, toward the direction trouble was least likely to arrive from. The Winchester lived on 2 wooden pegs above the hearth, within arm's reach of where he slept. He hadn't put those pegs there for decoration. Watch him move, and you learn everything the whispers couldn't tell you. His voice, when he used it, came out raspy and rough. The voice of a man who had gone days at a stretch without speaking a single word aloud, and saw no particular reason to remedy that. When he did speak, it was short, declarative. No words spent on courtesy because courtesy was a social contract and Dallas had canceled his membership. His hands were never still near a weapon, not twitching, not nervous, still in the way of something always ready. When he sat, the Winchester was across his knees or within a single motion of his reach. When he rode into Dodge City on Cinder, his right hand rested on his thigh exactly 3 inches from the handle of his revolver. Not aggressive, prepared. There is a difference, and Dallas understood it with the clarity of someone who had learned it the hard way. His eyes moved the way a hawk's eyes move. Not frantically, not with fear, but with the slow, complete rotation of something that has decided it will not be surprised again. He found the exits in every room before he found the faces. He registered threats before he registered names. He had trained himself to see the world as a series of variables to be assessed and managed, because that was safer than seeing it as a place where good things happened to people who deserved them. He had evidence, after all, that it was not. What Dallas had instead of people was a routine so precise, it functioned like armor. The jackrabbits. The buffalo meat when he could get it. The monthly ride into Dodge for flour, coffee, and lead. The fire that burned low at night. The prairie dark beyond the window, whilst the stars so thick overhead, they looked like salt spilled across black cloth. And Huck, always Huck. The dog who asked for nothing, who wanted no conversation, no explanation, no account of where Dallas had been or what he had done or what he carried. Who demanded no softness, no performance of wellness, no pretense that things were fine when they weren't. Who sat beside him in the deepest silences of the Kansas night and required only presence in return. Every person Dallas had ever let close had eventually revealed what they were actually after. His labor, his compliance, his grief made useful to someone else's agenda. Every single one had come with a cost buried in the fine print, and Dallas had paid every bill until he had nothing left to pay with. Huck wanted none of it. Not his labor, not his vote, not his conversation, not his history or his wounds or his carefully guarded reasons. Just him, just the fire, just the prairie, and that was the whole of Dallas's world. And he had convinced himself, with iron certainty, that it was enough. He was wrong. He just hadn't found that out yet. 2 years before the storm, Dallas found him in a coyote trap half a mile east of the bluff. He almost walked past. The trap had been set near a dry creek bed, one of those rusted iron contraptions that didn't discriminate between the animal it was meant for and anything else unlucky enough to step into it. Huck had been caught by the left hind leg. The steel teeth had done their work completely. The bone was visible. The blood had soaked into the dry Kansas dirt and dried black around the trap. And the dog had been there long enough that the flies had already made their calculations about how this ended. He was enormous even then. Young, but already carrying the frame of something built for a harder world than most creatures ever see. Gray coat matted with blood and dust, on ribs showing the math of too many days without food. And his eyes were not the eyes of an animal begging to be saved. They were the eyes of something that had already decided to die on its own terms and was furious at the interruption. When Dallas crouched down 3 feet away, Huck lunged. Not a whimper, not a flinch, a full, savage lunge that snapped the chain taut and tore something further in that ruined leg, and still didn't stop him from trying to take Dallas's hand off at the wrist. The growl that came out of him wasn't fear. It was rage. Pure, clarifying, I owe the world nothing rage. Dallas sat back in the dirt and looked at that dog for a long time. Then he said out loud, to no one in particular, "Yeah, I know exactly how you feel." He reset the trap spring with a flat rock. He wrapped the leg in his own shirt and carried 110 pounds of furious, snapping, ungrateful animal back to the dugout. Not out of charity, out of recognition. The month that followed was not a tender story. There was nothing soft about it. Huck did not gradually warm to Dallas's kindness the way dogs do in the kind of stories people tell to feel better about the world. He did not nuzzle Dallas's hand in gratitude. He did not look up with liquid eyes full of trust earned overnight. What he did was tolerate him. He tolerated the cleaning of the wound, though every session cost Dallas at least one new set of punctures somewhere on his forearms. He tolerated the broth Dallas boiled from rabbit bones and cooled before pushing toward him. He tolerated the low fire and the narrow dugout, and the man who sat on the other side of it without demanding anything. Not affection, not performance, not proof that the suffering had been worth saving. Dallas asked nothing of him. And slowly, over days that stretched like the Kansas plains themselves, flat and without obvious end, Huck stopped lunging and started watching. Watching was not trust, but it was the first step towards something. By the end of the month, Huck would eat from Dallas's hand. He would not wag his tail. He would not invite contact. But he would eat, when he would sleep within arm's reach of the man who had carried him home. And on the coldest nights, he would press his great gray flank against Dallas's side without either of them acknowledging that it was happening. That was as close to love as either of them knew how to get. What Huck became, in the 2 years that followed, was a legend in the only territory that mattered. The 3 miles of prairie around that red clay bluff. He was not a pet. Understand that clearly. He was a presence, a force. He moved through the tall grass like weather moves, without asking, without announcing, arriving where he arrived and leaving when he chose. His scars had multiplied since the trap. A new one across the bridge of his nose from a confrontation with something that hadn't ended well for the other party. The notched ear, the crooked hind leg that had healed wrong and never slowed him by a single step. He was moody in the way that genuinely dangerous things are moody, not erratic, not unpredictable, but operating on a set of internal standards that had nothing to do with what you wanted from him. He did not perform friendliness. He did not offer himself to strangers. Teamsters on the southern trail had learned to give the ridge a wide berth when they saw the gray shape standing on it. He was loyal to one human being on the face of this earth. One. That loyalty was the most valuable thing Dallas owned. More than the Winchester, more than Cinder, more than the dugout itself. Which meant it was also the thing he could least afford to lose. The thing is, you can build walls around yourself as high and as thick as the frontier will allow. You can close every door. You can file down every soft edge until nothing can find purchase. But you cannot build a wall around a dog. And Huck was about to make a decision that Dallas had no say in whatsoever. A man who has decided to quit the world still has to eat. That was the one concession Dallas made to the society of other human beings. One ride into Dodge City per month, lasting no longer than was absolutely necessary, conducted with the efficiency of a military operation and the warmth of a tax collection. The routine never varied. He would rise before the sun had fully committed to the day. He saddled Cinder, his aging bay mare, a horse who had long since stopped having opinions about anything, and load her with whatever pelts he had accumulated over the previous 4 weeks. Rabbit mostly, coyote when he could get them. Occasionally, a wolf pelt that fetched enough at Wright and Beverly's store to cover 3 months of coffee if he was careful about it. He would tie Huck's rope to the saddle horn, not because the dog needed restraining, but because Dodge City needed the visual reassurance that the animal was theoretically under someone's control. Then he would ride north, say nothing for 3 miles, tie Cinder to the hitching post nearest the store's entrance, conduct his business in the fewest words the transaction allowed, and ride back south before noon. That was the whole of his relationship with civilization. The trades were always the same. Pelts for flour, and pelts for coffee. The one luxury Dallas permitted himself without apology. The one smell in the dugout that felt like something other than survival. Pelts for lead and powder, because the prairie did not care how philosophically opposed you were to other people. It still sent coyotes after your food supply and occasionally something larger after you. He did not browse. He did not linger at the counter to exchange news with the store clerk the way other men did. Some leaning on their elbows and trading gossip about cattle prices and trail hand brawls and who Bat Masterson had pistol whipped on Front Street the previous Saturday. He stated what he needed, accepted what it cost, and left. The entire operation, start to finish, rarely exceeded 40 minutes. It was on one of these monthly raids, which is genuinely the most accurate word for what they were, that the Teamster incident occurred. Dallas was loading flour onto Cinder's back, his attention on the knots rather than the foot traffic on the boardwalk, when a heavy-set man with a wagon team pulled up close enough that his lead horse nearly bumped Cinder's flank. Huck, who had been sitting in the dust with the patient menace of a loaded weapon, rose to his feet. The hackles went up the full length of his spine. The growl that came out of him was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of sound that rearranged a man's priorities instantly. "Keep that beast on a short rope, kid," the teamster barked, pulling his horses back. Dallas didn't look up from his saddlebag knot. He didn't adjust his posture, didn't alter his expression, didn't grant the man the courtesy of eye contact. "He's on a rope for your protection," Dallas said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had long since stopped performing patience. "Not mine." The teamster stared at him, looked at the dog. It looked back at the young man who had delivered that line with all the emotional investment of a man reading a feed receipt. He moved his wagon. Huck sat back down. Dallas finished his knot. This was the life. Precise, self-contained, engineered down to its last detail to keep the world at exactly the distance Dallas had decided was safe. It was a good system. The problem with good systems is that they are designed to handle known variables. They account for the weather, for the lean seasons, for the dangers a man can name and prepare for. They do not account for a broken wagon wheel. They do not account for a woman who doesn't know the meaning of the word stay. And they do not account for what happens when the one creature you have built your entire life around looks at a stranger and chooses. What came next broke the only rule Dallas had ever lived by, and a dog saw it coming before the man did. We are just getting started, and this trail only gets darker from here. Every story we tell exists because someone refused to let it disappear. If this is your first time riding with us, now is the time. Subscribe before the next twist catches you off guard. And if you're still on the fence, drop a comment below. Tell us what's keeping you. Either way, you stay. Because what happens next, you will not want to miss. The sky over Ford County turned the color of a bruise 3 hours before the storm arrived. Not gray, not the flat, indifferent overcast of a regular Kansas afternoon. This was purple, deep and swollen, the kind of sky that looks like the atmosphere itself has taken a blow and is deciding whether to go down or fight back. The horizon to the southwest disappeared first, swallowed by a wall of red-brown grit that moved across the plains like a living thing, consuming everything in its path with the slow, total confidence of something that has never once been stopped. And the wind arrived ahead of it, the way it always did in Ford County, as a warning that nobody had asked for and everybody needed. It didn't gust. It didn't build gradually. It came fully formed and screaming, bending the buffalo grass flat in a single motion, driving red Kansas dust through every gap in the dugout's timber frame, sealing the world outside behind a curtain of grit so thick the Arkansas River bluffs to the north simply ceased to exist. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took Dallas to bank the fire and move the water barrel away from the leaking corner of the sod roof. He had ridden out dozens of these storms in 2 years. He knew the routine. Shutter the window, bar the door, light the second candle, wait. He was reaching for the bar when Huck stopped him. Not with a sound, not immediately. What Huck did first was stillness. The specific, total stillness that was different from his ordinary rest in the way a drawn weapon is different from one in its holster. He had been lying by the hearth, chin on his scarred forelegs, eyes half closed in the dim firelight. Then, between one breath and the next, he was simply no longer relaxed. Every muscle in that gray body came to attention simultaneously. His head rose. His nostrils worked the air in short, rapid pulls. And then, starting somewhere deep in his chest, not in his throat, not in his mouth, but somewhere structural, somewhere load-bearing, The growl began. It was low, subsonic almost, the kind of sound you felt in your back teeth before you fully heard it with your ears. Dallas had learned, in 2 years of living with this animal, to read that growl the way a sailor reads the water. There were gradations. There was the short, dismissive rumble Huck deployed when a coyote came too close to the bluff at night. Irritated, territorial, not particularly concerned. There was the sharp, rising snarl he reserved for anything that moved toward Dallas directly. This was neither of those. This was something Dallas had only heard a handful of times. Slower, more considered. The growl of a dog who had encountered something his existing categories couldn't immediately file. Dallas's thumb found the hammer of the Winchester before he was fully conscious of reaching for it. He cracked the timber door 2 inches. The wind hit him like a flat hand. Grit in his eyes, grit in his teeth, the cold of it carrying the particular fury of a storm that has been building its anger for 100 miles of open plain. He blinked against it, scanning the narrow slice of visible world beyond the doorframe. He was looking for a lawman's badge, a drawn weapon, the silhouette of someone who had tracked him from wherever the whispers said he'd come from. What he saw instead stopped him completely. A mule, on its knees in the dirt 20 yards out, its legs folding under the weight of a buckboard that had shed a wheel and was listing hard to one side, the whole rig threatening to go over entirely. The animal's eyes were white-rimmed and wild, its coat already plastered flat by the driving grit. And beside it, standing in the full fury of the storm with one arm raised to shield her eyes, was a woman. She was not what the word conjured in 1878 Dodge City. Not a saloon girl, not a homesteader's wife with flour on her apron and children at her skirt. The woman standing in that storm looked like the frontier itself had produced her. Sun-darkened skin the color of old saddle leather, hands that were visible even from 20 yards, as the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime in physical negotiation with the earth. Rope calloused, root strong, the kind of hands that didn't reach for help first. She was older than Dallas by a few years, and she stood in that howling grit with the posture of someone who had decided, at some point in her history, that weather was not a valid reason to fall apart. "My axles snapped and my mule's gone lame," she called out over the wind, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this request to strip it of anything that sounded like begging. "I saw the smoke from your chimney. I'm not looking for a bed. Just a place to tie the animal and a jack to lift the wagon." Dallas stared at her. His first instinct, immediate, trained, reliable, was to shut the door. He was already moving to do it when Huck pushed past his legs and walked out into the storm. Not lunging, not snarling, not the gray blur of fury that Huck deployed against every other human being who had ever approached that dugout uninvited. Walking. Deliberately, bucketed with the unhurried gravity of a creature making a considered decision, Huck crossed the 20 yards of storm-battered ground between the door and the woman, stopped directly in front of her, dropped his nose to the grit-churned earth around her boots, and raised it again. Then he sat down, in front of a stranger, in the middle of a Kansas gale, without a command, without an invitation, without 2 years of shared trauma as justification. He simply sat. Dallas stood in the doorway of his dugout, Winchester in hand, and felt something shift in his chest that he had no immediate name for. He watched the woman reach into her coat pocket. His grip tightened on the rifle, a Derringer, his mind supplied, a hideout gun, a weapon. She pulled out a silver whistle and a strip of dried venison. She tossed the meat without ceremony. Huck caught it without moving from his seated position. "He's a big one," she said, and then looking down at the dog with the same steady assessment she might give a river crossing she was about to attempt. "Looks like he's seen a few winters he'd rather forget." She looked up then, directly at Dallas through the driving grit, her eyes sharp and entirely unafraid. "I know the feeling," she said. Her name was Silas Vance, and the earthquake had already begun. Dallas offered her the dugout floor. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without decoration, and in the tone of a man discharging an obligation rather than extending a kindness. There was a blanket. There was floor space near the far wall, away from the fire, which was as much privacy as the dugout's single room allowed. It was dry. It was out of the wind. Silas looked at the floor, then back at him. "I'll take the wagon," she said. She said it the same way, no drama, no performance of independence, no pointed message intended. It was simply her answer, delivered and done with. She pulled an oiled canvas tarp from the back of the buckboard, crawled underneath it with the practiced economy of someone who had slept in worse arrangements than this and expected to again. And that was the end of the conversation. Dallas stood in his doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching the tarp settle over the shape of her in the listing wagon, while the storm continued its assault on everything outside. Then he went back inside and said nothing about it. That was the first thing he understood about Silas Vance. She did not take more than she needed. Not space, not warmth, not obligation. In a world where every person Dallas had ever known had eventually revealed the shape of what they were after, here was a woman who had been offered something and declined it. Not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but simply because she didn't require it. He didn't know what to do with that. For 3 days, the storm held Ford County hostage, and the wind didn't relent. The grit didn't settle. The bruised sky sat over the plains like a lid on a pot, sealing them all, Dallas, Silas, Huck, the lame mule, into the small geography of the bluff and the buckboard and the dugout's narrow warmth. What Dallas did during those 3 days was what he always did. He sat. He tended the fire. He cleaned the Winchester with the slow, methodical attention of a man who needed his hands occupied. Or he looked out the narrow, south-facing window at the curtain of driven grit and waited, with the patience of someone who had made a discipline of waiting, for the world outside to decide what it was going to do. What Silas did was everything else. On the first morning, Dallas emerged from the dugout to find her on the roof, her body flat against the sod, pressing fresh clay into the seam above the northeast corner that had been leaking since the previous autumn. She had identified it from inside the dugout. One glance at the dark stain spreading across the ceiling, and had simply gone up and fixed it. No announcement, no request for tools. She had found what she needed in the back of her wagon and handled it. Dallas stood below and watched her work for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The leak was there," Silas replied, without looking up from the seam. "So I fixed it." That was all. On the second day, she found his skinning knives in the wooden box beside the door. A set of 4 blades that Dallas used and maintained, but had never bothered to bring to a proper edge. She didn't ask. She retrieved the whetstone from her saddlebag, sat on the stump outside the dugout door in the partial shelter of the bluff's overhang, and sharpened every blade with long, sure strokes, while the wind tore at the loose ends of her hair. Dallas watched this through the window. He understood gradually, and that this was her language. Not words, she had no surplus of those. Labor, the expression of care through the fixing of things that were broken or the improving of things that merely worked when they could work better. She moved through the world with her hands first, and her words, when they came, arrived only after the work confirmed she had earned the right to them. It was a language Dallas recognized. He just hadn't expected to find anyone else who spoke it. What he had not expected at all, what he was least prepared for, in all the ways this 3-day interruption had defied his calculations, was what she did with Huck. She didn't pet him the way town women petted dogs, with the high-pitched cooing and the baby-soft hands and the performance of affection that the animal always met with a hard stare and a slow withdrawal. She didn't reach for him without permission. She didn't try to make him like her. She simply talked to him, Or she would sit on that stump, or crouch beside the wagon wheel she was inspecting, and talk to Huck the way you talk to someone who has been in the same hard places you have, and therefore doesn't need the details explained. She told him about the Red River crossing in the spring flood season, the way the current took a loaded wagon sideways before you could correct for it, the sound the water made against the wheel's spokes. She told him about the Cimarron in dry season, the way the sand shifted under a mule's hooves in ways that looked solid and weren't. She told him about the trails she'd walked alone, the camps she'd made in the dark, the nights when the coyotes came close enough that she could see the light catch their eyes. Huck listened with his full attention, his golden eyes on her face, his ears forward, the way he listened to nothing and no one else on this earth. And then, on the second afternoon, he rested his great scarred head on her knee. Dallas saw it through the window. The feeling that moved through him was not simple, and it took him longer than he would have liked to identify it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't suspicion. It sat lower than both of those, a dense, bitter knot somewhere beneath his sternum that tightened when Huck closed his eyes under her hand and loosened the rigid set of his shoulders the way he did at the end of a long day when it was just the two of them by the fire. It was jealousy. Moss raw and specific and entirely unreasonable. And Dallas knew all three of those things simultaneously, which did not make it loosen by a single degree. He had spent 2 years earning what that dog just gave a stranger in 48 hours. 2 years of shared silence and shared cold and shared survival, of asking nothing and offering everything he had left to offer, which wasn't much, but was entirely real. 2 years of being the only human being on the planet that Huck had chosen not to treat as a threat. And this woman, with a piece of dried venison and a steady voice and a whetstone she carried in her saddlebag, had walked into the middle of it and been chosen too. Dallas turned away from the window. He didn't have language for what that cost him. So he put another log on the fire and said nothing. On the final evening, the wind dropped to a whisper for the first time in 3 days, and the sudden quiet was almost louder than the storm had been. Dallas stood in the doorway, watching Silas brush the caked dust from her mule's coat in long, patient strokes. Huck sat beside her, as if he had always belonged there. "Why do you do it?" Dallas asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended, the rasp of too many days of near silence, and something else underneath it that he hadn't meant to let out. Silas kept brushing. "Do what?" "Talk to him. He's a dog. Or he doesn't understand your stories about the Red River or the Cimarron." Silas stopped brushing. She looked at Huck for a moment, really looked at him, the way she looked at a river crossing, measuring and honest. Then she looked at Dallas. "He understands tone," she said. "He understands that I'm not afraid of him. People like you and dogs like him spend so much time building fences that you forget what it's like to have a gate." She held his gaze without blinking, and without softening it, without offering him an easier version of what she was saying. "I'm just checking the hinges." Dallas had no answer for that. He stood in the doorway of the life he had built and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. The specific, disorienting vertigo of a man who has just had his most fundamental assumption about himself turned over and examined from the underside. He didn't respond. He went back inside. But he stood at the window a long time after that, watching the last of the Kansas light die on the horizon, and he did not reach for the Winchester once. The morning after Silas left, the prairie gave Dallas exactly what he had always wanted. Perfect silence. No wagon wheel creaking against the wind. No whetstone drawing slow arcs against a blade. No voice telling a scarred gray dog about river crossings and trail camps and the way the Cimarron shifts under a mule's hooves. Just the low moan of the Kansas wind across the bluff, and the crackle of the fire, and the vast, undisturbed quiet of a life returned to its designed specifications. It felt wrong in a way Dallas could not immediately locate or name. He sat with his coffee and looked at the corner of the dugout ceiling where the leak had been. The clay Silas had pressed into the seam was still fresh, darker than the surrounding sod, slightly uneven at the edges in the way of work done on a sloped surface in difficult wind. It would hold through the season, probably longer. He looked away from it. He looked at his skinning knives, lined up on the shelf beside the door, edges catching the firelight with a sharpness they hadn't carried a week ago. He looked away from those too. Huck was on the ridge. He had been there since first light, not patrolling, not scanning the horizon with his usual sentinel's purpose, but sitting in a single fixed position with his golden eyes locked on the trail that ran north toward Dodge City. The trail Silas's wagon had taken when it creaked away into the morning dark and didn't look back. Dallas watched him from the doorway for a long time. "She's gone, Huck," he said finally. His voice came out flatter than he intended, stripped of the authority it usually carried. People like that, they don't take root. They move. That's what they do. Huck didn't move, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge the sound of Dallas's voice in any of the ways he usually did. The ear flick, the slow tail, the slight repositioning of weight that meant he'd registered the communication and filed it. He just kept looking north. Dallas threw a scrap of gristle up onto the ridge. It landed 6 inches from Huck's nose. The dog didn't eat it. He looked at it. Then he looked back at Dallas with the full weight of those golden eyes. Patient, unblinking, carrying something in their expression that landed with the specific force of a question Dallas didn't want to answer. And Dallas went back inside. The days that followed had the same shape as every day before Silas had arrived. The same fire, the same jackrabbits, the same narrow window looking south over the same indifferent prairie. Nothing had changed in any measurable, external way. Everything felt different. The dugout, which had been a sanctuary for 2 full years, a place of deliberate peace, a structure Dallas had built and chosen and defended with intention, had developed walls. Yet not the timber and sod walls he had constructed with his own hands. The other kind. The kind you only notice when something has briefly shown you what the outside of them looks like. Silas had called it a fence, had said he'd forgotten what a gate felt like. Dallas spent 3 days trying to decide she was wrong. On the 4th day, he stopped trying. The following Tuesday, he saddled Cinder. He told himself it was necessity. The coffee supply was genuinely low, even when he was down to his last measure of powder. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the reason he tightened Cinder's cinch with more urgency than the task required, or the reason he rode north at a pace that had nothing to do with conservation of an aging mare's energy. He didn't examine the real reason. He simply rode. Dodge City received him the way it always did, with noise and smell and the indiscriminate chaos of a cattle town running at full pressure. Dallas navigated Cinder through the crowded press of Front Street with Huck at his side, his eyes moving through the crowd in their habitual pattern, cataloging and dismissing. Then they found what they hadn't known they were looking for. Near the Dodge House Hotel, sitting crooked against the boardwalk with 1 wheel missing and no mule in sight, was a familiar buckboard. Something about it was deeply, immediately wrong. The cattle drive had turned Dodge City into something barely contained. Thousands of longhorns were moving through Ford County that week, great dusty columns of beef and horn that stretched back across the plains farther than the eye could follow, converging on the railhead with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a river finding its delta. The smell of them preceded them by half a mile. The noise of them, that low, ceaseless, collective lowing that sounded less like individual animals and more like the land itself expressing dissatisfaction, had become the permanent backdrop of every conversation on Front Street. Behind the herds came the men, Texas outfits mostly, Trail hands who had been in the saddle for 60, 70, 80 days, who had eaten dust and slept on hard ground and crossed 3 rivers and lost cattle to storms and theft and the general hostility of the territory between the Red River and the Kansas line. They arrived in Dodge City wound tight and looking for release. And Dodge City, being exactly what it was, provided every available form of it without apology or restraint. The Long Branch was running day and night. The Alamo hadn't closed its doors in a week. Front Street was a press of bodies and noise, and the particular aggressive energy of men who had been cramped and disciplined for 2 months and had finally run out of trail to hold them together. Into this, Dallas rode Cinder at a walk, Huck moving at his side through the crowd with the flat, dangerous patience of something that had already assessed every person within 20 feet and found them all wanting. It was the sound that stopped him first. A single, shrill, mocking note cut through the noise of Front Street. Not a musical sound, but a deliberate imitation of one. The kind of sound a man makes with an object he has taken from someone else, performing ownership through use. Dallas turned toward it. There were 4 of them, grouped near the water trough beside the Dodge house. Texas trail hands from the look of their gear, trail-worn and whiskey loose and arranged in the particular formation of men who have decided, collectively, that they are entitled to whatever amusement the moment offers. 3 of them were laughing. The 4th, the one holding the silver whistle, was not. He was tall, spindly in the way of men who are stronger than they look, with a jagged scar that ran diagonally across the bridge of his nose. The kind of scar that doesn't come from an accident, that comes from a blade held by someone with intent. His name, Dallas would learn, was Garrick. He had the eyes of a man who had spent a long time mistaking cruelty for confidence, and had never yet met a consequence severe enough to correct him. He blew into the whistle again, another mocking note, and grinned at the men beside him. "Found it in the dirt, lady," he called out, tossing it up and catching it with an ease that was itself a performance. "Finders keepers." Dallas followed the line of Garrick's address to the boardwalk. Silas was standing against the post at the edge of the Dodge house steps. She was smaller against this backdrop than she had seemed on the prairie, not diminished, not defeated, but reduced by the sheer scale of the rowdy crowd surrounding her to something that looked, to anyone not paying close attention, like a woman who could be ignored. Her left arm was in a makeshift sling fashioned from what looked like a strip of wagon canvas, where the right side of her face carried a bruise that had gone the deep purple-green of the 3rd or 4th day. Not fresh, not fading, but settled in. Her jaw was set in the particular way of someone absorbing a situation they cannot immediately change without making it worse. Her eyes, though. Her eyes were exactly what they had been in the storm. Sharp and clear and entirely without fear. "Give it back," she said. Her voice carried across the noise of the street with the same steadiness it had carried across the wind. No tremor, no plea. A statement of what was going to happen, delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being the only person in a situation willing to say the obvious thing plainly. Garrick smiled. A woman freighting alone in Dodge? He tossed the whistle again, lazy and deliberate. "You're lucky we didn't take the mule, too." Dallas felt the cold fire start in his chest. He knew it well. Had felt it enough times in whatever life he'd lived before the bluff to recognize its specific temperature and weight. It was not rage. Rage was hot and fast and stupid. This was colder than that, more deliberate, the feeling of a calculation being run at speed behind steady eyes. He was already assessing Garrick, the 3 men flanking him, the distance to the Long Branch where 2 of Masterson's deputies were visible through the open door, like the position of Cinder's flank relative to a clean exit, the cost of blood on Front Street during a cattle drive when the law was already stretched thin and looking for reasons to make examples. He was still running that calculation when Huck stopped running it entirely. The dog was simply gone from his side. And then he was elsewhere. A gray blur of muscle crossing the distance between Dallas and Garrick in the time it took the crowd to register movement. No warning growl, no escalating display. Huck did not negotiate. He launched. His full weight hit Garrick at chest height, massive jaws snapping shut on empty air inches from the man's throat as Garrick screamed and went backward into the dust. The silver whistle flew from his hand and skittered across the dry earth, spinning to a stop near the water trough. The three flanking men scattered. The crowd on Front Street went silent in the complete, total way that crowds go silent when they suddenly understand that what they are watching is not entertainment. "Kill that beast," someone behind Dallas shouted. Garrick was scrambling in the dirt, his hand clawing for the peacemaker on his hip, his face the color of a man who has just felt his own mortality graze his throat and not enjoyed the sensation. Dallas was between the dog and the guns before the peacemaker cleared the holster. He didn't draw his own weapon. He stood with his hand resting on the handle of the Winchester and looked at Garrick with the flat, total calm of a man who has nothing left to lose and has made his peace with that fact, which is the most dangerous kind of man alive, and everyone watching Front Street that afternoon understood it immediately. "The dog is mine," Dallas said. His voice was low, conversational almost, the kind of quiet that in a certain register is louder than anything you could shout. The whistle belongs to the lady. You've had your fun." He held Garrick's eyes without blinking, without heat, without the performance of aggression that frightened men resort to. "Walk away before this gets expensive for everyone." The silence held for 3 full seconds. Garrick looked at Dallas, looked at Huck, who was still showing every tooth in his head, vibrating with a primal restraint that looked extremely temporary. Looked at the Long Branch door where the deputies had appeared on the threshold, hands on their belts, watching. Looked back at Dallas. He spat in the dirt. "Your cur nearly took my hand off," he hissed. But he didn't draw. He stood, brushed the Kansas dust from his coat with wounded dignity, and jerked his head at the men behind him. They moved. The crowd exhaled. Silas stepped down from the boardwalk. She walked to where the silver whistle lay in the dirt. I crouched with the careful movement of someone managing a body that hurt in more than one place, and picked it up. She wiped it on her trouser leg and closed her fist around it. Then she walked straight to Huck, still bristling, still showing teeth to the retreating backs of Garrick's outfit, and put her free hand on the side of his great gray face. The dog went still. His tail moved once, a single heavy thump against the dust. Dallas looked at Silas's arm in its makeshift sling, or at the bruise, at the careful way she was distributing her weight. "You're hurt," he said. It came out differently than he intended, less like an observation, more like an accusation directed at the universe in general. "I've been worse," Silas said. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough. She had been worse, and Dallas was about to find out exactly how much worse things could still get. Because Garrick hadn't walked away to lick his wounds and leave it alone. He had walked away to set a trap, and it was already waiting. Only subscribers ride with us into what comes next. Don't get left behind in the dust. And before we move, comment, ride, or die below if you would have stepped between that dog and those guns without a second thought. We want to know who's riding with us. The Dodge City Livery sat at the low end of a side street that ran toward the Arkansas River, and it smelled like the accumulation of every animal that had ever passed through it, and every man who had ever worked it. Old leather and wet straw and the sharp, ammoniac bite of decades of use soaked into timber that had never once been cleaned properly and never would be. It was the kind of building that felt like a held breath. Low rafters, deep shadows between the stalls that the lantern light hanging from the center post didn't reach and didn't try to, and the back half of the structure was pure darkness. the kind that swallowed shapes whole and gave nothing back. Dust moved in the thin column of light beneath the lantern in slow, suspended particles, the way dust moves in places where the air hasn't circulated properly in years. Dallas stood at the entrance for a single moment, reading it. He had been in enough places like this, places where the geometry was wrong, where the sight lines were deliberately obscured, and where the shadows were deeper than the available light accounted for, to know what they meant. His hand moved toward the Winchester and stopped there, resting, not drawing, waiting. Beside him, Huck's nose dropped to the straw-covered floor. The dog didn't need direction, didn't need a command, a gesture, a word of any kind. He simply lowered his head and moved. Not at the searching pace of an animal following a cold trail, but with the focused, purposeful momentum of one following something recent and clear. Silas's mule had been here. The scent was hours old at most, laid down in the straw in the particular pattern of an animal that had been led rather than walked freely. Short, stressed steps, close together, the track of something frightened and compliant. Huck moved through the dark stalls without hesitation, and Dallas moved with him, reading the dog the way he had learned to read him over 2 years of shared silence. The set of the shoulders, the angle of the head, the quality of the breathing. When Huck's pace tightened and his head came up slightly, Dallas knew they were close. The mule was in the last stall on the left, tied with a rope that was new and expensive, not the equipment of a man who had casually acquired a stray animal, but of one who had planned to keep it. The mule's coat was dark with dried sweat, and its eyes still carrying the white-rimmed expression of an animal that had been handled badly and hadn't forgotten it. That animal's been paid for. The voice came from the shadows to the right of the stall, and with it, the unmistakable double click of a shotgun hammer finding full cock. Vane stepped forward into the edge of the lantern light. He was the livery's operator, a man built along the lines of someone who had made a career of asking no questions at the right price, and with a face that had long since settled into an expression of permanent, comfortable dishonesty. The shotgun was cradled in his arms with the ease of familiarity. Behind him, from the deep shadows at the back of the livery, Garrick emerged. The 2 trail hands flanking him completed the geometry of what this was. Not a confrontation. A trap, set and baited and sprung. Garrick's face carried the particular satisfaction of a man who has been humiliated in public and has spent the intervening hours constructing a situation in which that humiliation can be answered privately, without witnesses, without the complicating presence of Masterson's deputies watching from the Long Branch doorway. "Paid for with stolen silver," Dallas said. His voice was the same as it had been on Front Street. Low, unhurried, stripped of everything that wasn't necessary. "I'm taking the mule, Vane, now." Garrick stepped forward, his hand dropping to the peacemaker on his hip. "You think that dog moves faster than a bullet, Hermit?" Dallas didn't answer. He didn't reach for the Winchester. He looked at Huck. It was a look that carried everything 2 years of shared life had built between them. Not a command, not a signal, not the kind of trained communication a man uses with a working dog. Something older than that. The look that passes between 2 creatures who have survived the same things and trust each other's instincts past the point of needing words. Huck looked back at him. Then, from the entrance of the livery behind them, a single sharp note cut through the darkness, the silver whistle. The sound lasted less than a second. One piercing, melodic note that rang against the low rafters and the stall timber and died in the straw. But it did exactly what it needed to do. Garrick's eyes moved toward the entrance. Vane's grip shifted on the shotgun. The 2 trail hands turned their heads, one heartbeat of fractured attention. Huck didn't lunge for Garrick's throat. He lunged for the lantern. The calculation, if a dog can be said to calculate, was almost impossible to account for. Not the nearest threat. Not the armed man. The light. The single hanging lantern that was the difference between a livery full of shadows, where 4 armed men had every advantage, and something else entirely. His full weight hit the post. The lantern swung hard, the hook giving way, and it dropped into the loose straw at the base of the nearest stall. The glass shattered. The hay caught in the way dry Kansas straw catches, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, in a wall of orange light and black smoke that went from nothing to everywhere in the space of a single sharp breath. The heat hit Dallas's face like a flat hand. The horses in the far stalls screamed and threw themselves against their boards. The smoke moved faster than the fire, filling the rafters in thick, rolling waves that turned the lantern light amber and made the shadows jump in every direction simultaneously. Vane shouted. Garrick threw his arm across his face, and the trail hands broke for the entrance. Dallas grabbed the mule's lead rope and ran. The back doors of the livery were timber on a crossbar, the work of a single motion, shoulder into the wood, bar giving way, cold night air hitting like a physical thing after the heat and smoke of the burning straw. Dallas went through them at a run, Huck at his heel, the mule pulling hard on the lead, but moving, finally moving, he hooves finding purchase on the packed earth of the alley behind the building. The night air tasted like the river, cold and clean and carrying the particular sweetness of outside after enclosed danger. The flavor of a situation survived. Dallas's lungs pulled it in hard as he ran, the mule's lead in his left hand and his right hand finally finding the Winchester, finally drawing it, though there was nobody behind them yet. He ran until the livery's firelight was 50 yards back, and the shouting was muffled, and the alley opened onto the side street that led back toward Front Street. He stopped. Huck stopped with him. Not winded, barely affected, chest heaving once, twice, then settling. His golden eyes moved back toward the orange glow above the livery roofline with a calm, assessing expression, as if checking his own work. Dallas looked down at him. "Good dog," he said. It came out rough and quiet, and entirely inadequate. Huck's tail moved once. Silas was at the end of the street. She had dragged herself there, that was the only word for it. The only honest accounting of what it cost a woman with a broken arm and a body that had already been through more than it should have been asked to absorb in a single day, to cover the distance from the Dodge House boardwalk to the end of that side street on her own. As she was leaning against the corner post of a building, her weight entirely on one leg, her face pale in the way of someone running on the last of something. The silver whistle was in her good hand. She looked at Dallas, at Huck, at the mule behind them, then at the orange glow cresting the roofline of the livery 2 streets over. "You came back," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, stripped of the steadiness it had carried all day, carrying instead the raw, unguarded sound of someone who had not been entirely certain in the dark of the last half hour that anyone was going to. Dallas handed her the mule's lead rope without a word. 3 words. "You came back." Not, "Thank you." Not, "I knew you would." Not the language of someone whose experience had given them reason to expect rescue or return, or any of the things those words implied. Just 3 words delivered in the voice of a woman who had spent enough of her life watching people leave from the wrong end of their departure to have developed a complicated relationship with the concept of return. Dallas heard all of that in those 3 words. He didn't address it directly, because this was not that kind of conversation, and they were not that kind of people. Men in the street behind them still smelled of smoke, and the night was still full of the sounds of Dodge City conducting its business without regard for what had just happened 2 streets over. He handed her the mule's lead rope. She took it with her good hand. The animal pressed its nose briefly against her shoulder in the way of something relieved to be returned to a known quantity, and Silas steadied it with a single firm stroke along its jaw. Practical, understated, everything. They left Dodge City without discussion. There was no conversation about where they were going, or why they were going together, or what the arrangement was called. Dallas brought Cinder around, checked Silas's buckboard wheel with his hands in the dark. The replacement she had made during the storm had held, and helped her up onto the seat with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he applied to anything that needed doing. She didn't thank him. He didn't invite thanks. Huck took his position at the side of the wagon without being told, moving alongside it at an easy pace as they rolled south out of Dodge, away from the lantern light and the noise and the smell of cattle and whiskey and coal smoke. That was the permanent atmosphere of everything north of the bluff. Dallas rode Cinder on the other side. He didn't look back, but he was aware, with every yard they put between themselves and the town, and of the shapes that receded behind them. The skeletal outline of the Dodge house, the flat facade of the Long Branch, the dark vertical geometry of the gallows at the edge of town, standing against the night sky like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he was finished reading. They grew smaller. Then they became suggestions. Then the prairie swallowed them entirely, and there was nothing behind Dallas but open dark and the sound of wagon wheels on dry ground. And then he had ridden that road north 100 times. He had never felt it go in the other direction before. A mile out, Silas spoke. "Why did you come back?" she asked. Not the same question as before. Not you came back as a statement of surprised fact, but the actual question underneath it. The one that had been sitting in the space between them since Dallas had handed her the lead rope and said nothing. Dallas rode another 20 yards before he answered. He looked at Huck, moving alongside the wagon with his head up and his tail carrying its first easy swing of the entire day. The gait of an animal that had gotten what it came for and was satisfied with the outcome. "I told you," Dallas said. "The dog has better judgment than I do." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," Dallas agreed. "But it's the truth." She didn't push further. She understood in the way of someone who had spent enough time around closed things, on that some gates open one hinge at a time. You don't pull them off their posts just because you found them. The wagon rolled south. The dark of the Kansas prairie opened around them like a hand releasing its grip. And Dodge City disappeared behind them. Every gallows, every saloon, every whisper that had ever been spoken about the young man who had carved himself into the side of a bluff and declared himself finished with the world. Gone. They made camp 5 miles south of Dodge City, and in the shallow lee of a grass ridge that broke the wind enough to let a fire hold. Dallas built it small and practical, the kind of fire that serves its purpose without announcing itself to the dark. Silas saw to the mule while he gathered the wood, working in the easy, unspoken division of labor that had developed between them somewhere in the 3 days of the storm, without either of them arranging it. When the fire was going, she lowered herself to the ground with the careful movement of someone taking honest inventory of the day's damage, settled her back against the wagon wheel, and looked up. Dallas looked up too. The Kansas sky at night, 5 miles from the nearest lantern, is not something a person forgets. The stars were extraordinary. Not scattered, not sparse, but dense and layered and relentless, packed so thickly across the black that they looked less like individual points of light and more like something had been spilled up there and left to settle. Salt on black cloth. A quantity of light so excessive it felt almost aggressive, as if the sky was making an argument about scale and fully intended to win it. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire crackled. The mule shifted its weight. Somewhere out on the dark prairie, a coyote called once and went unanswered. Huck chose his position with the deliberateness he applied to everything. He didn't go to Dallas's side, where he had slept for 2 years. He didn't go to Silas, though he looked at her for a long moment with those golden eyes that had always seen more than they were given credit for. He walked to the exact midpoint between them, turned once, and lay down. Between them, the bridge he had always been, finally occupying the position openly. His chin dropped to his forelegs. His eyes closed. The firelight moved across the gray of his coat in slow, warm pulses, softening the jaw scar, smoothing the notched ear, making him look, just for this moment, just in this light, less like something that had survived the world's worst attempts on it, and more like something that had simply come home. Dallas watched him for a long time. At some point, he couldn't have said exactly when, Dallas became aware that his hand was not on the rifle. It was resting on his knee, open, still. Not 3 inches from the Winchester's stock, not curled around the grip out of the habit that 2 years of solitary living on the Kansas frontier had made as automatic as breathing. Just resting. The way a hand rests when the body it belongs to has, for the first time in longer than it can clearly remember, run its calculation of the immediate environment and returned a result that didn't require readiness, when he looked at his own hand as if it belonged to someone he was only just meeting. He had not felt safe, genuinely, physically, in the body safe, in so long that he had stopped noticing the absence of it. The way you stop noticing a sound that has been constant long enough. The vigilance had become the baseline, and the baseline had become invisible. And somewhere in the process of that invisibility, he had forgotten that it hadn't always been this way. That there had been a time, and before whatever had happened back wherever the whispers said he'd come from, when his hand had rested on his knee, and meant nothing more than that he was sitting by a fire. He looked at Huck, asleep between them. He looked at the fire. He left his hand where it was. "The trail to the panhandle is long," Silas said. She said it the way she said most things, without preamble, without the social scaffolding of a question that was really a question. A statement of fact he offered into the space between them, available to be picked up or left alone entirely. "I could use a scout," she continued. "Someone who knows how to read weather, and a dog who knows when a storm is coming before the sky does." She didn't look at him when she said it. She was looking at the fire, her good hand turned palm up on her knee in the unconscious posture of someone who is offering something without demanding it be taken. She didn't ask for more than he could give. She never had. Dallas looked at the stars, at the fire, at the dog lying between them like a solution to a problem neither of them had known how to solve alone. He thought about the dugout, the low ceiling, the narrow window facing south, the Winchester on its pegs above the hearth, within arm's reach of where he slept every night for 2 years against a danger that had never come from outside the walls. "I've spent enough time in a hole in the ground," he said. He said it quietly, and without drama, in the tone of a man closing a door on a room he had lived in long enough and had finally finished with. "Maybe it's time I saw where the trail leads." The Hermit of the Arkansas died that night. Not violently, not with the kind of dramatic finality that the frontier usually reserved for endings. He died the way most things die when they are ready, quietly, by the fire, under a sky so full of stars it could hold the weight of any number of lives beginning again. No, in his place. A man of 23 with too much history, and for the first time in longer than he could account for, something resembling a direction. Beside him, a woman who had never once asked him to be different than he was, only to remember that a fence and a cage were not the same thing, and that gates existed for a reason. Between them, a gray dog with a crooked leg and a scarred jaw, who had known all along exactly how this ended, and had simply been waiting for the humans to catch up. "We want to stay with you here for a moment before we let this story go, because this one is worth sitting with." The easy version of what Dallas and Silas's story teaches is this: let people in. Trust is worth the risk. Love finds a way. Clean, comfortable. The kind of lesson that fits on a sampler and asks nothing of you. That is not what this story actually teaches. What this story teaches is harder and more specific and considerably more useful than that. Silas didn't tell Dallas to tear his walls down. She never once suggested that what he had built was wrong, or that his reasons for building it were invalid, or that the wounds that had driven him 3 miles south of Dodge City and into the side of a Kansas bluff were wounds he should simply decide to be over. She said, "You've forgotten what a gate feels like. That is an entirely different thing. A wall with no gate is not protection. It is a prison that faces inward. It keeps the damage out, yes, but it also keeps everything else out, and eventually it keeps you in so completely that you stop being able to tell the difference between safety and solitude, between chosen peace and enforced isolation, between a life you built and a sentence you're serving." Dallas had been serving a sentence for 2 years and calling it freedom. Most of us know exactly what that feels like. We have just given it different names. So here is the question we are leaving with you tonight, and we want you to answer it honestly. Not for us, but for yourself. What walls have you built that you have convinced yourself are protection? What have you kept out that you actually needed? What gate did you seal so completely after something cost you more than you were prepared to pay, that you forgot it was ever there? And here is the secondary question, the one that cuts even closer. Is there a Huck in your life? A creature, a child, a person who sees clearly what you have trained yourself not to see? Who keeps sitting on the ridge and looking north toward the thing you told yourself you didn't want anymore? Because sometimes the most honest thing in the room is the one that can't lie to you. And sometimes it takes something that operates purely on instinct and loyalty and the complete absence of pride to show a person what they have been refusing to show themselves. And now, the debate we promised you. Some would say Dallas was right to close himself off after whatever broke him. That the frontier was genuinely dangerous. That people had genuinely cost him something irreplaceable. And that a man who protects himself from further devastation is a man exercising hard-won wisdom, not cowardice. Others would say Silas was the bravest person in this entire story. Not for standing her ground against Garrick on Front Street. Not for dragging herself to the end of that alley on a broken arm with a whistle as her only weapon. But for reaching for the hinges of a gate that was not hers to open, with no guarantee that the person on the other side wanted to be reached. What do you think? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. We ride together on this channel. That is not a figure of speech. Every story we bring to this fire. Every name pulled from the dust of the American West. Every life that the history books filed away under miscellaneous and moved on from. We bring it here because we believe it deserves a circle of people willing to sit with it, to hear it, to carry something from it back into their own lives. You are that circle, and tonight you rode with Dallas, with Silas, and with a gray dog who understood something about loyalty and gates and the courage it takes to sit down in front of a stranger in the middle of a gale. Something the rest of us are still learning. We hope you're carrying something from it. The next story waiting at this fire is darker than tonight's. It comes out of the same Kansas dust, but it goes somewhere the frontier rarely let people come back from. We will not tell you more than that. What we will tell you is this: you do not want to be the person who missed it. New stories don't wait. Subscribe now. The next one won't announce itself twice. If this story moved something in you, if it cracked something open that needed cracking, share it with one person tonight. Not for the channel. For them. Because some people in your life are sitting in their own dugout right now and they just need someone to check the hinges. From all of us at Redwood Chronicle, keep riding. The trail doesn't end here.